Asia, a geographically expansive and populous region characterized by fascinating social and cultural variation, is fueling more than half of the world's economic growth. How do we look at the relevance of Asia's rich diversity and the economies? How to address the complicated business politics connections? And are there profound cultural differences between the East and the West? That clash is inevitable, as Professor Samuel Huntington claimed. To discuss these issues more, I'm very happy to be joined by Professor Roger Ames from the Department of Philosophy of Peking University and Professor David Bartosz from the School of International Relations and Diplomacy of Beijing Foreign Studies University. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, sir. How do you define Asian values?
I would say that we don't want to define Asian values. I think that what that does is it homogenizes half of the world's population. Why would we want to do that? The richness of Asia is its diversity. There are Pan-Asian traditions. There's Confucianism, there's Buddhism that define different elements within Asia. But the idea of Asian values is really simplistic. India and China, these are not the same civilizations at all.
Perhaps conceptually, the biggest exception when it comes to Asian values, or whether we have a monolithic Asian civilization, would be Indonesia, which boasts of the largest Muslim population.
Sure.
However, transformation, economic and political, in this big country has been very successful with the end of the Cold War. I wonder, Professor Bartosz would agree with me that Asia is arguably a very diverse continent with different civilizations. If there are very different civilizations, what are they? And when we look at the issue of Asian values, I'd like to have your thoughts.
I think Asian civilizations, I very much agree with Professor Ames that Asian civilizations should not be seen as a rather monolithic block, but we should try to learn to differentiate between Asian civilizations. However, we also have to see the unity in multiplicity. I think that's very important, because all of these different civilizations have always nurtured mutual contact. They have been engaged in trading along the ancient Silk routes. They have exchanged religious views, world views, philosophical ideas, have been traveling from the east to the west, from the west to the east. So it is very hard to say, it's not possible to say that these differences are to be understood as some kind of separateness. There is a unity in multiplicity. And so...
Now, gentlemen, the centerpiece of this discussion on dialogue is meant to provide our skeptical audiences around the world with a clear answer as to whether the Asian continent does have its unique homegrown values. My understanding is that Professor Ames doesn't want to comment on the so-called Asian values, partly because he might stand for universality of values that the human civilization should share at this defining moment of globalization. Is my understanding correct, Professor Ames?
Yeah, there's a real difference between shared values, common values, and universal values. What is distinctive about European culture is that European culture has traditionally, as its own ethnocentrism, defined itself in terms of universal values, the one true God that everybody should worship. In China and in Asia broadly, I think you have a concept of common values or shared values. I think what David is saying is absolutely right, that there's a continuity in Asia, a historical continuity. There's a transfer of values, there's mutual influences, but there's also really important uniqueness. We can say, for example, that Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and China are all Confucian cultures in some degree. But these are very different civilizations. These are very different traditions. And so I think what is important is that we understand the differences, that we take the differences among cultures and activate them and produce the kind of diversity that constitutes cultural growth.
Cultural diversity in our examination of Asian values is one thing. Geopolitically, it might be quite another. For example, Madam Kiron Skinner, policy planning staff director of the State Department in the White House, said recently that China is the first great power competitor that the US has faced. That is not Caucasian. In the end, is the argument not about ideology or civilization, but about race, Professor Bartosz?
I have to say I'm very unhappy with that wording, because there are several arguments against it. First of all, I'm from Germany, so I always have mixed feelings when somebody uses terms which are related to the concept of race, because actually today in Germany we do not even use the word race anymore, because we have made such bad experience.
The Second World War.
The Second World War attached to this term. We have a very bad history, made a very bad experience, and of course a very bad influence has been exercised on the world using that term. However, also modern genetics shows us that even actually fixed races do not exist. So the research of Harvard professor David Reich has shown that actually there are no fixed races. Each phenotype of a certain group of people is already a mix of older people having mixed maybe 10,000 or 5,000 years ago. So there are no fixed races. There's always interflow of genes and mixture, and new forms of phenotypes are created. Thirdly, I also think that this is very strange to say so, because you have a large in the US, for example, there's a large group of American Chinese, right? There is Afro-Americans, there is Latin Americans. Are they all excluded from being US citizens now? On the other hand, you have Chinese minorities like the Tajiks, who are if you would like to use the word Caucasian, you would have to define them as Caucasian looking, but they are part of Chinese minority, or the Russian minority in China.
And the negative impact of globalization, for example, free movement of labor resources, as well as the tidal waves of asylum seekers from the Middle East following the wars, we see the dynamic rise of populism on the platform of unilateralism and protectionism. That said, it seems that in this age of globalization, many countries are seeking for their national identity. Russia is no exception, for example. For centuries, Russians have been trying very hard to figure out whether they belong more to the European civilizations, or they should trace their roots back in deep in the Euro-Asian continent, given the 250 years of Mongolian invasion and occupation of Russia in the past. What do you think of, say, the things that make Asia different from Western civilizations?
I think if we take China as an example, that from the very beginning, you have the central plains of China, and then you have the kind of diversity that is Europe. But somehow or other, like in Henan, in Anyang, they have this Museum of Writing, Wenzi Boguan, and on the oracle bones you have a vocabulary of already 5,000 words. An educated Chinese person can recognize maybe 4,000 characters. And so what you have is you have a cultural attractor that brings all of this diversity into one identity. And so you have diversity and identity at the same time. I think that that's the kind of pattern that you see in Asia generally, that India has that same kind of a tradition where all of this diversity at the same time has some kind of a continuity. I think that that is really different from Europe, which in the modern time is looking for a European Union, but it has a tradition of these different nation states that have identified them. Only now, only today, are they coming to see that having a European identity, as well as having a German identity and a Belgian identity, is really a plus, is an opportunity for national growth, for cultural growth.
Despite the deep economic integration in the age of globalization, we've had an academic discourse by Professor Samuel Huntington of Harvard on clashes of civilization. And with the end of the Cold War, we have Professor Francisco Fukuyama calling for the last man and the end of history, characterized very much by liberal democracy that goes hand in hand with the liberal market economy. And they hailed the success of Western values, so to speak. Professor Bartosz, this is why I asked the question about how Asia is different from the West. Otherwise, we're going to have more of a crusade by Christians against Muslims, or with countries like China calling for harmonization, which is the core image of, core message of Confucianism, right? We agree to disagree. We seek common but differentiated sort of perceptions about the world.
I would very much agree with what Roger has said. And I would like to add that when I analyze Chinese ancient civilization, compare that with other civilizations like the Iranosphere or the Hindu sphere or also other civilizations in Asia, especially with the ancient Roman civilization, it pretty much strikes the eye that Chinese civilization right from the beginning always somehow managed to create stable, sustainable economies, or at least to a much larger extent than, for example, other empires like the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire always based its economy on warfare, so they had to go to war because their economy was not sustainable, while in China the economy always was the Chinese administrators somehow managed to create somehow self-recreational economies right from the beginning. And I think this is also related to Confucian Daoist tradition, also to other philosophies, Mohism, for example, other influences which have been absorbed into the Confucian lore on the way, also Buddhist, later Buddhist influences and so forth. One of the great thinkers to be mentioned here is Wang Yangming, for example. And I think this is maybe something which characterizes the Sinosphere, or the influence of Chinese civilization in East Asia, and also in Japan and the Korean Peninsula as a whole, cultural influence, and which is somehow different from, for example, most civilizations which have an Indo-European language family background. Although also there we cannot generalize, because there are also Indo-European language family-based civilizations which did not expand, which did not need warfare to expand. So, for example, you just mentioned the Indian civilization. So they also created stable forms of economy. They did not use warfare to expand.
You are watching Dialogue with Professor Roger Ames and Professor Bartosz. We've been discussing whether the rise of an Asian hemisphere, which was first put forward by Professor Keshe Mabumani in Singapore, would be characterized very much by shared values or common values, or Asia would rather be defined more by its richness and diversity. We'll come back to take a closer look at what makes Asia different in the age of globalization. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, gentlemen. So, Professor Ames, you deny vehemently that there is such a thing like a Pan-Asian identity. You do deny.
No, I mean, Asia is Asia. I mean, there's a continuity among these civilizations. There's contacts and so on. But the idea that Indian values and Chinese values are shared in some way, I think is to impoverish both of them. I think that it's the differences among these worlds that really is the opportunity for these cultures to grow each other. But the tradition of China is really to ingest all of this kind of difference in shaping its own identity. And so there's a sense in which the Chinese model is the model of Asia, that on the one hand we can talk about sort of a continuous historical relationship among these great civilizations of Asia, but on the other hand, recognizing and activating their differences is really the way that the world can grow. The kind of problems that we face in the world today, when you talk about liberal values, the idea of individualism is a model of winners and losers. The problems that we face today, global warming, pandemics, environmental degradation, and so on, these are not problems that individual actors can solve. These are problems that only collaboration can solve. We have to move from a winners and losers kind of a model to a winners and winners kind of a model. And if there's a value that's defining of Confucianism, it's this idea of a teacher can only be a great teacher if he has a great student. And the better the student, the better the teacher. And so you have this ji yu li or li ren kind of
教学相长.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
The teacher and the students would reinforce each other academically and intellectually.
Exactly.
But let me come back to examine why there have been debates even within the United States as to whether Madame Curran Skinner, an African-American lady, a policy planning staff director of the State Department, raised this very idea, a controversial one, about China being the first great power competitor, non-Caucasian, non-white. Does it mean that we would have this inevitable clash of civilizations? Because this is getting racial, getting nasty. I know Germans would deny the very mention of racial elements in our discussion about the civilizations and why Asia is gaining momentum in this process of globalization. Professor Bardosh, do you believe there will be yet another crusade against China simply because we are non-Christian civilization?
I very much hope not, because it would be
wishful thinking.
It would be absolutely
you wouldn't
the wrong
expect
way.
this to happen.
I wouldn't
it is
expect
well
it to
underway,
happen.
I'm afraid.
I think, first of all, there is not just. I think we should not. Of course, we have to focus on that, but there's also other civilizations. They are also very important. There is the Islamic sphere, where we have different civilizations. We have to analyze the Iranian civilization elsewhere, which is not only restricted to
Iran is being singled out for punishment. Secretary of State Pompeo pushed the oil exports of Iran to zero in the hope of totally cutting off the lifeline of the Persian economy. So when you talk about the Persian civilization, I'm afraid you're falling into the trap that Secretary Pompeo lays out deliberately to kind of isolate this country and to hopefully, rekindle the religious, ethnic, and sectarian clashes between Israel and even between Shiite Muslims in the Middle East.
But what I think what we have to think about is that, as Roger also said, that actually China is the real melting pot. Right? China is, if you look by the history, it's the first tribes, which the Yanhuang, which were the starting point of Chinese civilization. There were already two tribes joining forces peacefully, and then other peoples were included, like the Chuguo, the ancient country of Chu. And so China is, in a sense, like I always imagine like a galaxy absorbing more and more people, and the basis for that is not some kind of dogma or some kind of religious belief structure. It is culture. It is culture. So the basis of Chinese civilization, if we look at the Confucian civilization is culture, and what is culture? Culture is basically the intention of the concept is refinement. We should not underestimate this power of refinement, because what really defines us as human beings is that we are self-refining living beings, and Chinese civilization has shown the mastery over that force of culture. So don't underestimate.
Arguably, this is very bad for the United States, because what BRI actually implies for the White House, for the State Department, for the Pentagon, for maybe some of the Europeans, is that we not just refine, but we rebuild the world economic order with the BRI. That means the US-led world order since 1945, since the Yalta framework, would be redefined, rebuilt, and the leadership will be replaced. US leadership around the world would be rebuilt. For example, Fareed Zakaria, a columnist of the US media and also a moderator of CNN, said that in the post-US era, the rise of the West would cause more dangers and unpredictability for the Caucasian civilization and perhaps for the US leadership. What do you think of this kind of conspiracy theory? China feels very much embarrassed, by the way.
Yeah, I think it's conspiracy theory. I think that what we've seen in one generation is a sea change in the economic and the political order of the world. That in one generation, the energy of transformation has shifted to Asia, the Indian economy, the Chinese economy, Southeast Asia, you mentioned Indonesia, that these part of the world is growing at a huge rate. And so will a new world cultural order follow in its wake? Liberal values, the idea of independent individuals, independent states, competing with each other to win and lose. This model is obsolete. It's no longer a model that we can use to define our relationships in the world. We have to move from that kind of a model, that kind of fragmented wall-building model, to a model...
So you seriously disagree with Professor Alison Graham from Harvard University on Thucydides' tribe?
Yeah, I do.
You do disagree?
I disagree. I just disagree that maybe in this particular time, Asia has to assume leadership in, as America withdraws from international relations, as a beleaguered Europe builds walls in order to keep out immigration, maybe Asia, where all of the energy of transformation is happening. This idea of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is not a new idea. This is Tianxia. This idea goes way back into the Chinese classics. The idea of finding a mutual winning situation. And so I don't think it's something to be afraid of. I think it's something to welcome.
I think also it is something which the Belt and Road Initiative somehow is also the appearance or reappearance of certain kind of economic infrastructural initiatives of ancient China, which have always shaped the fate of Eurasia as a whole, not only Asia but also Eurasia. I think maybe we should even start to get away a little bit from the term Asia.
I'm afraid President Putin may have strong reservations about the Eurasian idea, because he has the strong voice about the Eurasian Union, which means it is Russia that should dominate this process of regional integration in the Asia-Pacific region.
I say that because actually first we have to ask the question, where does the term Asia come from? It's an ancient Greek term. It's a mythological figure. It's a woman called Asia. She is the wife of Prometheus, and Prometheus is the person who gave fire and who was the inventor of many fundamental tools and inventions which have made civilization possible in Greek mythology. And the Greeks thought that these inventions came from the east, from where the sun is rising. Another etymology of Asia goes back to the Akkadian Empire, Asu, the word Asu means where the sun rises in the east. So that's where civilization and culture comes from. That's also shows the veneration of the Greeks. And actually, if you ask Greek people, they would say, yeah, we are also part of Asia, because Alexander extended the influence of Greek civilization to a place which is now called Tajikistan, right? If you ask a Tajik person, and Tajikistan is right at the border to China, they would say, of course, we have Greek ancestors as well, right? We share that. There's a bond between Europe and Asia, and it's artificial to try to cut that bond. Also, there's a cultural historical bond between these two spheres, and actually they are cultural terms, right? So,
in fact, when we take a close look at the BRI and what it implies, deep in the Chinese mind and deep in Chinese culture, we have this father figure dominating the hierarchical and vertical political order, quite against the rule of law that the United States and other members of the West stand for, namely to level the playing field and to encourage fair and free competitions. Well, that gave rise to very deep cultural debates, if not clashes of civilization. That's one of the major reasons why I happily invite Professor Ames and Professor Badosh to discuss whether Asian should be defined as a cultural identity. A pan-Asian identity is surfacing very much in this age of regional integration. I'll see you next time and talk more about why we have this conference on dialogue of Asian civilizations. This program is indeed intended to be a prelude to this conference. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.